All right, hello everyone. I'm Andrew Roots, and next to me, if I can point in the right direction, is David Wood over here, and we are the principal investigators. I don't even know if that's what we're called. We're the leaders of a grant called From Residence to Relevance. From relevance to resonance.
Yeah,
If
let's
I
get
could,
that
I don't get it the other way around. So we're taking this time for folks in our grant, but hopefully others who find us on YouTube to talk about my book, When Church Stops Working. That is a lot of the ideas were honed with David
right.
in this grant. And so that's our idea, is just to give you a book discussion conversation around now chapters 4 and 5. We went through the first part of the book earlier, and have to say, you don't need to know this because of the magic of when you stream it. But it's been a bit. It's been a minute or two since we've done the last session, as life's
Yeah,
getting busy here in the fall and as we move towards Christmas. But this doesn't matter when you're listening to it. But so we're gonna talk about chapters 4 and 5, and I'm gonna hand it over to David. And hopefully, this is a resource you can use with your folks if you pick up this book and dive into some of these conversations that David and I have been curating and investigating with the pastors we're working with. So, yeah, David, take it away.
great. Thanks, Andy. Greetings to everyone. Um, in this session, we're covering these two chapters, as Andy said, chapters 4 and 5. There are two major themes that I want to pull out, have us sort of have Andy and I talk a bit more about. The first one is on waiting, which has already been talked about in the earlier chapters, but in this section of the book, I guess it's right to say, Andy, sort of you drill down deeper into this. And the second theme I'll pick up as we close out will be the theme of crisis that you elaborate on. So let's take another shot at this whole dimension or posture. I think is the best word for it, of waiting that you name. I think is the principal. What's the right word? Disposition or of a church and of pastors in particular. I think. And and I think you go to great pains to sort of make it clear once again, as you do early in the book, but you do more so here, that this is not about just it's not about a standstill. It's not about being stalled. It's not about this sense of wasting time. But there's a whole lot of tension involved in waiting, and it's like one of the ways in which we experience waiting differently in everyday life is it has a lot to do with what we're waiting for
Mm-hmm.
or who we're waiting on. And I think in one of your, I don't know if you do in this book or one of your other books, you talk about the difference between waiting for, let's say, traffic to clear versus waiting for a baby to be born, right? Of course, we're in the middle of Advent as we're doing this, so that's kind of an appropriate thing. So, talk about those. I think that's a nice way of helping people realize waiting can sometimes have a sense of fullness to it and
Mm-hmm.
not emptiness or wastefulness.
Yeah. I mean, I think you'd agree with me. Like, I think in all religious traditions, there's a dynamic of waiting that's involved in them, and
Right.
waiting has a sense of fullness to it. I was thinking about this the other day. I don't know that it's possible to wait and not be waiting for something. You're
Yeah.
always waiting for something when you're
Right.
waiting. Like you said,
Right.
the light to turn, the second part of the final season of The Crown to drop. You're always waiting for something. But I
Yeah.
do think that what's interesting and is really interesting for congregational leadership is, and this connects with all our work we've done on Charles Taylor and Heart Rosa in their own way, but really on Taylor, is that what you wait for shows kind of what your moral vision is. Like
Yeah.
what you're willing to wait for, what you think is, what you're anticipating, what you're
Hmm.
bending your attention to, what you're giving your attention to. It
Yeah.
will tell you what you think will really make your life full. And that's a very Charles Taylor thing, a very Hartmut Rosa thing, is to say that there's a kind of objective in the modern project to do away with waiting, to almost make
Hmm.
waiting an enemy. And Hartmut Rosa draws from Zygmunt Bauman, and Bauman has this really powerful phrase where he says part of the modern project is to take waiting out of wanting, so
Hmm.
that like there's the time between getting what you want becomes shorter and shorter. And that's how we get all
Yeah.
these fast food and fast everything. And like sometimes I say, like, here comes your Amazon the droid that's going to drop it off, or the
Yeah.
immediate Amazon arrival. Like that's Amazon's
Right.
big problem. How can they get you stuff quicker?
Right.
And yeah, so I do think it really points to what we think
Yeah.
is good.
And I think you again talk about this. We'll talk about this in other places where if you just think just sort of superficially about the narrative of Scripture, you've got the story of Jesus, who shows up at 33. I mean, I'm sorry, around about 30 years old. So there's a whole lot of waiting in there. I mean, but then the Apostle Paul, right, who gets touched and called, and yet goes through an extended period of waiting before he actually sort of comes onto the scene as the apostle. Of course, you've got the story of Israel, which wanders around for 40 years waiting in the desert. You've got the story of Moses. You've got the story of even Jacob. But there's a whole lot of narratives in Scripture in which waiting just seems to be built in to the formative way of being and responding, if you will, to God's leading in people's lives. And the way God shows up tends to involve more often than not a period of waiting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biblical themes are really significant ones there. That
Yeah,
in many ways Israel is the waiting people. There's just a kind of constantness of
yeah,
waiting,
yeah,
and the church follows that in being waiting a waiting people as well. And yeah, that's just really an interesting dynamic of the modern project that we hate that so much. This need to wait, and yet biblically it's everywhere. I mean, one of Jesus' last commands to the disciples, at least in Matthew, is to wait with me in the garden, and
right. Yeah, yeah,
and they can't do it. And so you do
right.
really wonder about a church that can't wait. Is it a church that maybe can't be with Christ? That's a bold statement, but there is a really deep assertion where God doesn't want our necessarily our skills, or to show our skills, or to even win ground and resources as we're trying to get at this grant. But there is something that whatever renewal will come with a sense of being able to wait.
Yeah. And you do talk about in later chapters, which we'll get to in the next session, is you talk about Martin Luther King, but that got me thinking about the civil rights movement as a
Yeah.
whole, and particularly the way he led it, and he and his peers led it. It seemed you could always make the case that the civil rights movement itself, under the leadership of King and his fellow leaders, it was all about waiting, waiting on God, waiting on something, and nonviolence was the way of waiting, right? But there was nothing passive about that waiting, right? It was full of a kind of, readiness and attentiveness, and in a way restraint, but also it took one's whole self to learn how to wait. Is that a
Yeah,
fair analogy, you think?
absolutely. Yeah. And I'm no civil rights, era historian or anything, but it's really clear that first of
Mm-hmm.
all, King has an incredible conception of Protestantism,
Yeah,
and realizes that there's a deep Protestant connection, that ordinary life should be a place where people are upheld. Like there's something significant about ordinary life. So how does resistance works? You go and you wait in the
yeah,
most common public spaces, and
yeah,
at diner counters and on bus seats, and you wait.
yeah,
You wait for your humanity to be seen, which is
yeah.
there's something really interesting too. I was just recently reading. There's this big King reader, and all of his Christian Century pieces are in like part
Uh-huh.
one of this thing. And one of the things that's just absolutely captivating is how much he thinks civil rights is obviously for the freedom of the African American community, but how much it's also for the freedom of the white community. Like
Right, right,
that there's a sense that waiting and in a kind of action to see the humanity of the other draws the humanity out of even the
yeah,
oppressor, and so there's something really powerful at play where waiting becomes a form of resistance. And I think Israel sees that there's a sense where one waits and waits attentively with a story, and King has that. I mean, in the I Have a Dream sermon, there's a sense that the the long arc of history bends towards justice. He believes
Right.
that because he believes God is coming and God is God and God is going to do this. He doesn't think this is like a natural evolutionary fact. He thinks that this
Yeah.
is a historical reality of an inbreaking God of Israel who does this. And so he's willing to wait for that because he's willing to make the claim that God is God.
Yeah, it opens up a space that otherwise wouldn't be there, a space for response. And it's also it is inevitably about trust as well, right? And a kind of surrendering of one's own agency as at the same time one's exercising a certain kind of agency. I mean, it's a really nice image, I think, of
Yeah.
how that movement is so much about waiting. But let's bring it
Yeah.
back to the congregational life for a second. And you talk about when you talk about what are we doing when we're waiting, you talk about eating and praying and um, remembering and rehearsing. That's what we're doing all the time. And so the waiting is full of a kind of being, a kind of a way in which we inhabit time and space, right? So
Mhm.
not nothing. It's not passive in the sense that we think about it. But it's a certain kind of action, right? Is that the way to put it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think, to use a concept that's been important to you, David, in your work, that there's a certain sense that waiting is friendship and friendship is waiting. Like friends wait together. What do they wait for? The unfolding of life. They wait to be together. And so yeah, is it I think we have a certain moral aversion towards waiting because we feel like waiting is wasting. And maybe this
Yeah,
is a connection with congregational life, is we feel like we're in the midst of a great loss of resources. So the last thing we should do is wait. The
yeah,
last thing we should do is that, because the resources are so depleted already, and we should feel absolute shame if we waste them. But I
yeah,
wonder if it doesn't work the other way. That actually the way back into life is to wait together. And one word we didn't use there that I think is really important is a waiting church is one that laughs together a lot. I mean,
uh-huh.
there's some crying and mourning together, but there's also a lot of laughter. In many ways, I think the kind of temperature of waiting is resonance. It is a sense of
Mhm.
connection, and you're waiting well when you're friends with each other and you're laughing and you're crying and you're telling stories um, and yeah, you're in anticipation. You have a story you share together, but there's a sense of laughter and friendship.
And and going back to our earlier themes, when we are so captivated by the narrative of decline, it evokes a kind of anxiety and this sort of sense that we have to be about doing something to solve this issue of decline, and it turns us away from the very things you were talking about as so necessary to center us and allow us to be non anxiously in the midst of time and circumstance
Yeah.
and whatever that might be. And when we get caught up in all this activity, we're no longer in that posture of waiting, and we're no longer listening. We're no longer able to respond to what God might be doing in our midst, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to give it another connection that I don't use in the book, but thinking of the French thinker Ellul, who does all this stuff around technology, and he really
Yeah.
wants to draw a parallel between presence and technology. And
Uh-huh.
I think we are quite addicted to technology in the broadest frame. So we feel like the church is in decline and we need a kind of technology. And we don't really trust that what will save us or what will renew us is presence.
Yeah.
Ultimately the presence of God, but that presence of God that comes in the midst of our presence with one
Yeah.
another. And to find presence, to enter into the dynamic reality of presence, connection, resonance, you have to be willing to wait. You have to be
Yeah.
willing to receive as much as give. And if you can't do that, you can't have this kind of connection. And
Yeah.
it's no wonder in a society that's just utterly obsessed with technology, we're like, just go more, 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 optimize, optimize,
Right.
optimize, get more out of this. And yet, what happens is that smothers the profound mystery of presence.
Yeah. I mean, reading this reminded me of a story of a church I led in Maine several years, no, many years back in the was it early 2000s, and it was a small church in a
Back when you were
small
like
town.
23, right, David? You were like
What's
23.
that?
First call,
Yeah,
23 years old. Yeah.
No, this one I was actually, gosh, I must have been in my late 40s, and it was again, it was a church that it was a sleepy little town, a sleepy church, and had sort of been on a pretty serious decline and sort of hanging on. And so I came in there, gangbusters, okay, we're going to really do something here. And I desperately, personally needed something to happen, right? For my own sake, my own ego, whatever you call it, to sort of prove that I was in a really good place. All those motivations that sort of get mixed up in us. And anyway, it was clear that that was not going to go easily, right? And so I remember sort of in some ways, I think just sort of settling in and being there and going along and doing the things I could do, but mostly trying to sort of call them into a way of being a community that was new to them, and yet sort of beginning to build that experience. So looking back on it, I guess in some ways I think I maybe moved from a more aggressive stance to a more just sort of being there and trying to really understand what it meant for this community to become a worshiping community in a new way, but within the confines of what it already was in some ways. Anyway, in the early, gosh, it must have been, I think I must have been there maybe less than a year, and something horrible took place. It was one of the key lay leaders in the church, young guy who was he would have been the person I needed most to be involved in bringing about change in the church. Just this young, effervescent, running this company, this excavating company in this place in Maine, and he was killed tragically in a snowmobile accident, and it just devastated the church. It devastated the town. He was so well known, and so there we were in the midst of this. You call it a crisis, this real personal crisis, and uh, I just sort of felt like we needed to make room for this. And so I said to the people involved, the family and so forth, I said, and to my leadership in the church, I said, I think we need to have a vigil here at the church with Tracy, that's the man who died, and have his body, have the viewing take place in the sanctuary, in the church, that we just open it up and invite the town in, because no place will be able to hold all the people who want to come. And they responded immediately to this. And so that this little church became just alive with a kind of energy as we made space for this and opened it up, and people streamed into the church. And then we said, we will leave the body here all night long. We'll have a vigil all night long, so that somebody will be here with Tracy throughout the night. And they did that. They signed up and they went all through the night, different members of the church. And I look back on that and I think that was so transformative of the space. The space was never the same again. It went on to be a tremendously renovated space, and Tracy's sort of spirit was brought all that, helped to bring all that about. But again, I think it's an example. I don't know if you think this. I'm curious if you think this. To me, I think of that as just being attentive to what comes, to what happens, and then what it meant to be present to these people in this time, in this space, not thinking, oh, this might make X, Y, or Z happen. You're just sort of responding, listening in the moment, responding, and doing the next thing, and doing so within the tradition that we share as Christians. And also then doing it in a public way that brought all these people into the space in a new way, and the church sort of began to see itself in a different way within a bigger story. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, to me that's a beautiful story. I mean, I've heard you say it before, and it's to me it encompasses exactly what I'm hoping in this grant. What I'm hoping people will read the book will yearn to be this kind of congregation. I mean, at a really brute level, you think like, well, what did you do? Like, what do you do with that body? Like, what was the point? Or you could think really crassly and be like, how do you parlay that into new members? You know what I mean? Like, you could think all that stuff, and yet there's just something fundamentally beautiful about what you did. Is you waited with this body. You gave a community presence in death, and to me, that's the really profundity of the Christian story.
Yeah.
That it's God's presence in death that will
Yeah.
then produce life. And the Protestant churches in America, at least, are so yearning for life, and yet
Yeah.
we have been kind of tempted into the idolatry of thinking some kind of technological rationality will get us out of this,
Yeah.
instead of the power of a presence that we try to witness to in our shared life. And this is what you do as a pastor: set up and lead people to be present with one
Yeah.
another in life and in death, and in death in
Yeah.
anticipation of life. I mean, that there's nothing more profound than that. And
Right.
what a good that I mean, a good in the deepest way that offers a society as a public act of waiting.
And
I don't
and
know.
and what you could only uh, what we did only made sense because we were a church, right? It wasn't like
Yeah.
nobody else could have done this, right? It was a church that would have had to take this on and enact this in this way. And so I think it also drew people deeper into that identity of what it meant to be a part of a story
Mm-hmm.
that is bigger than themselves, is bigger than death in a way, right?
Yeah.
It, at the same time encompasses this.
Yeah.
Um, but I think if I was too busy doing other things, and I would have, I'm confident I would have missed it. I would have been too busy in other ways, right? That so easily take up what we do as pastors, and
Yeah.
I would not have been as present. So, well, we didn't get to crisis, even though I think we talked about it. In terms of how crisis can function and how essential it is, if you will, to the formation of a community. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe next time we can sort of take that up a
Yeah.
bit. But
Yeah, and maybe the teaser is that waiting itself is a crisis. This is why we
yeah,
resist it. That,
yeah,
like, why do you wait in this incredible pastoral story? Part of it is because you have to enter the crisis, that there's a
yeah,
demand to
yeah,
enter the crisis. But the crisis, so again, like, what I'm worried about is the crisis is fewer people, fewer money, less money, fewer resources. Instead of the crisis is these are human lives of people
yeah.
who have died, and we grieve. And um, entering into that kind of crisis, the crisis of what it means to be present, the crisis of what
And
it means
and
to live well.
I would say too the crisis of where's God, right?
Yeah.
That sort of that is a crisis moment, right? And we don't sort of try to explain that away or
Mm-mm.
dismiss it as much as we enter into it and
Yeah.
take it on in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll start there with episode 4, our final episode, where we hit the last 3 chapters. So that's where we'll go next. I hope people will watch, and that they won't pay attention that we're going to be wearing the same shirts, so that they were just, we were recorded a minute later. But no, it could be months. So
It could be, yeah.
it could be. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks
All right,
everyone for listening, and David, thanks for a great conversation.
all right.